Hey everyone, I hope this is a good sub to post this in. I posted elsewhere and someone suggested posting here. In this particular crime, the perpetrator is thankfully behind bars, but I still struggle with the why of it all. So, my part of the story starts in 2009, and I was a junior in high school. I lived in a small town in Ohio. In the fall, I started to date my first real boyfriend, John. John was a senior and many of his friends were dating my friends, and he was well liked and funny at school. I'm thrilled about the relationship, especially because my strict parents seemed to like John as well. He's pretty quiet around them, but always polite and appreciative in their presence. Since it's a small town, John lived literally down the street, and we hung out all the time. My parents are actually getting divorced at the time, so I liked spending time at his place more than mine. John lived with Chris, a man who wasn't his biological dad, but someone that he had lived with since he was around 13, and he often called his dad. Chris was an adolescence counselor who knew John because he had been in foster care, and he had taken John in. Chris was an amazing human who was fun to be around, and it was just the two of them and their dog, Murphy, at the house. I didn't know much about John's childhood at first, other than it had clearly been rough enough for him to be involved with child services. Anyways, we spent a lot of time together, and always had a good time with Chris as well. Eventually, John confided in me that he often had pretty bad thoughts. I was shocked by this, and I told Chris about it as well. And we continued to date, and I did my best to support him. So, the next year, I'm a senior and John has graduated, but he's not really doing anything. He didn't go to college, and his plans to join the military weren't working out. So, he was living with Chris and was working a part-time job that my dad had gotten for him. I've always been into school and extracurriculars, and I felt like John was holding me back. Our relationship was going downhill in many ways, but I was scared that if I broke it off, John might really hurt himself. He had threatened to do so when I tried in the past. In May 2011, I graduated high school and decided I have had to leave the relationship behind. I was having my own depression issues, and John was having a detrimental effect on my mental health. I finally told him that we had to break up, and he needed to stop contacting me, threatening self-harm. I mostly cut off contact, and a couple of months later, I got an apartment with a friend about 30 minutes away from home, and beside the college that I was attending. One Friday night in April 2012, I'm in my hometown to see a friend, and I pass John's house where I see police cars everywhere. I'm shocked and I assume the worst about John, so I immediately called our mutual friend Kyle. Kyle has no clue what's going on with John, and he says that John had hung out at his house the day before. Kyle said that John seemed like he was in a good mood, especially because he was driving Chris's Beamer at the time, which he loved to do. Anyways, Kyle was actually chilling in my apartment with my roommate. This is normal because he had a crush on her, so I just kept driving that way. When I got to my place, Kyle hadn't heard anything, but my mom calls me with the scoop. She's friends with the cops' wives. It's small town stuff. It turns out that John had killed Chris and was on the run somewhere. Someone had called for a wellness check after not hearing from Chris for a while, and the cops found his body at home. I was shocked and a little scared, as were Kyle and my roommates, so we all decided to stay at my roommate's parents' house for the night. By morning, the cops had luckily found and arrested John. He had taken the Beamer, so it was easily spotted at a rundown motel about 15 miles from his home, about 12 miles from our apartment. When the details came out, the whole thing was even more horrifying. It was a brutal act, and it had occurred days before the body was found, which meant that John was just hanging out at Kyle's house between committing this act and getting arrested, just nonchalantly playing video games, telling jokes to Kyle's little sister, acting like everything was fine. Meanwhile, he had stuffed Chris's body in their freezer at home. It's insane to think about how someone could be such a psychopath, and there was really no explanation given. John initially tried to plead insanity, but he was eventually deemed competent and then pleaded guilty. He got 30 to life in prison. I've obviously told this story from my perspective, but the person who really matters in this is, of course, the victim. Chris was truly a saint of a human being. He had been my role model for so many years, and you just wonder how could something so horrific happen to someone so good? And at the hands of someone that they had given everything to. Someone they had loved, trusted, and seen as a son. It's horrifying. Chris spent his life advocating for kids like John, and the local center he worked at is actually named after him now, as is the street that it is on. As I said to begin with, I often wonder about the why of it all. Chris and John got along almost all the time, and though John clearly had mental health issues, no one thought that he would hurt anyone but himself. But clearly something was very wrong with John that we had missed. They say hindsight is 20/20, and I can definitely look back and think of a few strange instances with John. Sneaky, manipulative, and angry. He eventually showed all of those traits, but I was lucky enough not to experience any violence at his hands. I wish I could say the same for Chris. I'm thankful for the time I did spend with him, and the positive impact he had on my life during that time. I know that he had a positive effect on so many other lives as well. May he rest in peace. At the age of 12, I started babysitting for family friends who had 3 daughters, ages 4 to 7. They lived in a cul-de-sac where nearly every home housed a young couple, with children in the local elementary school. The neighborhood was extremely close-knit, like the 1950s American Block Party communities. They had a communal policy on using one another's toys. Any kid could use a play structure in someone else's yard anytime without asking. Shortly after, I started working in the neighborhood. They revised the rule to anytime a family is not using a babysitter to watch their kids, to ensure that I would not get overwhelmed supervising a swarm of kids I wasn't paid to watch. It was thus more or less known when parents were going out and leaving someone else in charge of their children. I was welcome to take the girls to play in any other yard as they wanted. Their parents even gave me permission to let them play in someone else's yard or a sandbox independently if I needed a short break. Being an avid Babysitters Club reader, I didn't leave the girls outside unsupervised ever. I would wait until someone else wanted a water or a bathroom break, and then corral everyone inside temporarily. Similarly, when the girls wanted to play in the treehouse owned by an older couple a few doors up the street, I climbed up despite a slight fear of heights, and crouched in the little house with them, despite feelings of claustrophobia to follow my own rule. I don't recall whether my everyone inside, everyone outside together rule preceded the first odd interaction I had with the immediate next-door neighbor or not. But when the police questioned the girls that I babysat years later, they said nothing bad ever happened when I watched them, because I had set up that weird, sometimes annoying rule. One day while playing basketball with the girls in the driveway, the next-door neighbor came outside in a baseball cap and sunglasses, and sat down on his second-story deck to read a paperback. I later noticed that he had turned his chair around 180 degrees to face us and the basketball hoop. I couldn't tell if he was looking at us. He had no reaction to me staring at him, flipping pages in the book like someone when they're reading. This behavior repeated every time he played basketball for the 5 years that I watched the girls. Eventually, once I had noticed him in the chair, accessories on, I would suggest a game we could play inside or in the front yard, but out of view. The strange neighbor was familiar to me as he went to my local church. I have never seen someone kneel in a pew, head bowed and hands folded, with the same level of intensity before or since. Once when my family was seated behind him, The priest came over to ask me to lead the children's mass during the homily because the usual person was out sick. This guy turned around and glared at me like I personally set out to interrupt his prayer time. When I worked in the church's nursery during various masses, I would often make eye contact with him as he waited in line outside the nursery door to use the restroom. From what I gleaned from our family friends and other people in the neighborhood, the odd basketball observer was a nice guy who gave up his apartment and job in the city to move in with and care for his sick, elderly mother. Since everyone thought he was so great, and since he went to church, this was before the Catholic sex scandal had broke out, I figured I was in the wrong for finding him creepy. Even as a young 12-year-old, I was used to guys in their 40s and 50s asking me to go somewhere with them, or driving by slowly as I walked, bite, jog to make lewd comments. I figured I was projecting those experiences onto this awkward, quiet guy who wasn't doing anything wrong. For instance, I was certain that if the guy next door was a creep, he would not miss the opportunity to watch with his sunglasses on and book in hand while the kids and I went swimming each summer when the family opened their above-ground pool. But he never set foot out on his deck when the kids and I donned swimsuits to play in the pool or the backyard. I was more convinced I was conceited and mean. That's when I was 15 or 16. I caught him looking in the window as I cleaned up after movie night. The girls and I had put on a film after bath time, and instead of watching it theater style in total darkness, we kept some lights on so I could braid the girls' hair. The big screen TV we used for movies was located in an addition on the house with floor-to-ceiling windows. Though my parents were OCD about shutting blinds and curtains when the sun went down to prevent people from seeing in, our family friends had no window treatments on the big, modern windows. When I turned off the last light in the room, a floor lamp right next to a window facing the neighbor's house, I could see into the darkness outside where that weird man sat on his deck in a chair, in line with the window I was looking through. I looked over my shoulder and realized that he had a line of sight on where the girls and I sat on the floor during the movie. As I looked back towards the house, I glimpsed him hustling inside. I would have doubted I would see him at all if he had not left the chair in an unusual spot. After watching him turn the chair around to read during many a basketball match, I knew where the chair sat that night, facing the window into the family room. It was not the chair's usual position on the deck. After that incident, I would suggest playing board games in another room, or insist on watching movies theater style to ensure that he could not peep on what we did at night. Once the girls were asleep, I avoided the family room entirely because I was paranoid about being watched. If I wasn't in the kitchen doing homework or reading, away from all windows, I would walk around the original first-floor footprint of the house, where all the windows had curtains. The first time the parents noticed my change in routine, they insisted I could watch TV or movies in the family room. I didn't mention anything to them because I was worried my concerns were silly and conceited. When I was 17, my family heard an evening cable news story about a man in our town caught in a police sting operation, in which a woman pretended to offer up her 2-year-old. When they raided his house, the police found a ton of horrible things on his computer. Our family friends called a couple of weeks later. They wanted to know how I knew the young man next door to them was not safe. He was the guy that I had heard about on TV. As they described it, the police found his blog where he wrote about his obsession with one of the girls who lived next door to him. It detailed his fantasies involving her and his plans to act on them. Things like lying in the treehouse for hours, hoping to corner her when she climbed up alone to play. Many of his entries focused on taking advantage of or kidnapping the girl, while the babysitter was in charge. In his head, babysitters were like the ones in old movies, talking to friends on the phone or making out with a boy they invited over, instead of caring for the children. As it became clear that I did neither of those things, his plans evolved to killing the babysitter, taking the girl, and getting out of Dodge. After talking to the girls to ensure that they were not victims, the police suggested that I might know something to have acted the way that I did. All the pieces, the frequent run-ins at church when I had children in my care, or the weird things that he did when he knew I was watching the kids next door, all fit together cohesively. I was relieved I was not mean-spirited or imagining things. I was perhaps conceited. The focus was not on me but on the children. But I was not crazy. Several years ago, I worked at a crisis unit for the acutely mentally ill. It was a 10-bed unit where individuals would come to stay as a step-down from a psychiatric hospitalization or a diversion to prevent psychiatric hospitalization. I often worked alone on the weekends. One Friday evening, we had received an admission, Michael. Background info was provided with the referral indicating a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder and recent release from prison after serving a sentence for murder. I completed the initial intake meeting with Michael, during which time he had said some inappropriate things to me. I made it clear that that was inappropriate and that confidentiality was limited, and that the staff working on the unit as part of his treatment team would be privy to anything said in the interview or subsequent one-on-one sessions. He responded well to the redirection, and we finished the intake, and I went about the rest of my shift until about 11 p.m. that night, when he had approached the office and asked if I was working alone. Luckily at the time, I wasn't alone, and I told him that my male coworker was in the adjoining office. After this encounter, I explained the situation to my coworker, who read my shift summary and decided to sit down with Michael and tell him the way he was acting was not acceptable and that he could risk being released from the program if it continued. The next morning, I was working alone from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Around 9 a.m., I went to wake up another client, Jeremy, to administer his medications. The room Jeremy was assigned to was at the end of the hallway, and he was usually slow to get up in the mornings. While I was knocking on Jeremy's door, Michael approached me to tell me that he didn't appreciate that I'd shared the things he said to me with my male coworker. I explained to Michael that he knew what he said was inappropriate, and that he knew anything he said to me would be shared with the rest of the treatment team. Michael became more agitated and got on my face, backing me into the corner in front of Jeremy's bedroom door. At this point, Jeremy had woken up and heard what was happening outside his room. Jeremy came out of his room, stood between Michael and myself, and told Michael that he needed to walk away and calm down. Michael went back to his room, and I contacted my supervisor, who told me to document the encounter and continue my shift. Needless to say, I left that job shortly after this incident. I am thankful for Jeremy and that he had the presence of mind, while also being a client with a mental illness, to intervene on my behalf. I often wonder what would have happened if Jeremy wouldn't have woken up, or if he would have been in a more severe state of mental illness and would have become agitated as well. Update. For those saying I couldn't possibly have worked by myself in a 10-bed unit, it was not a secure unit. It was a voluntary unit and was never intended for violent individuals. Michael should have never been there. He needed a higher level of care than what we could provide. But to get funding, we needed beds filled. I was a bachelor's level MH worker. I administered medications, facilitated psychoeducational groups, and completed one-on-one sessions with clients every shift. I shouldn't have to work alone, but I did. I don't know if it was legal, and I'm assuming it is in my state, but I have no idea. Protocol was to call 911 if things got out of hand, and if they were really bad, to petition for involuntary hospitalization of the individual. Weekdays, there were 2 staff and a supervisor present. Evenings, there were sometimes 2 staff members, depending on the day of the week. Overnight, there was 1 staff, and on the weekends, it was me by myself, until the cooking or cleaning person came for roughly a half hour each. It wasn't an ideal situation, but it is common in residential homes for individuals with intellectual disabilities, and some personal care homes where I'm from.